It's a difficult time for anyone between the ages of 18 and 21. They're becoming people then. Up to this point in life, they've been dependent. They've been children in the home of their fathers. Very frequently, as with most of our students, they're away from home for the first time in their lives, and they're having to make decisions for themselves of the sort that were normally made, if not as a group, made in consultation with one other person in the family. But it's a very, very hard time in life for them. They're expected to become intellectually mature, emotionally mature, and physically mature, all at the same time. And the youngsters today, they come into your office, they'll often come to talk to you about their classwork.
The professor looks at his college. This program was edited from 4 hours of separate conversations and has been arranged to form a dialogue. Participating are Professors Catherine Carroll, Charles Flora, Arthur Hicks, James Macquarie, Richard Reynolds, Herbert Taylor, Ralph Thompson, and Mary Watrous, all of Western Washington State College in Bellingham.
They think that they are going through this alone, that the experience is unique, that no one else has ever gone through it. But this would happen, of course, I think, even to students, or even to young people outside of a college. It happens, however, without the kind of intensity that is common here. It is the nature, I think, of young people whose lives are changing greatly under the impact of learning, to feel sometimes like odd men out. And all too often, if you cannot understand this intellectually and respond to it accordingly, you respond to it in outbursts either of good-humored prankishness, or sometimes you respond to it in outbreaks of just plain out-and-out violence.
I refuse to be very seriously alarmed about such an episode, for instance, as the smashing of a piano. Much as I love music and much as I admire the piano as an instrument of musical expression, I refuse to be very seriously disturbed by this little incident.
It's a part of the nature, I think, of young people to let off steam. It has always been so. As an historian, for instance, I'm always impressed when I'm reading documents of the Middle Ages at the kind of hijinks that the students went through even then. For instance, there is a celebrated proclamation issued by the regent of the University of Paris back in the 13th century, in which he warns that any students caught in the future playing dice on the high altar of Notre Dame Cathedral will be forthwith dismissed from the institution.
I think it's natural, because I think an 18 or 20-year-old individual, a 17-year-old individual, a 16-year-old individual, probably one of the main things they think about in life is sex. Now, they're unable to realize their ambitions in this regard, so I think there ought to be some outlet for their energies, and this is one possible outlet.
The value of extracurricular activities interests me a bit. Some of the students seem to think of them as a means of release.
The college curriculum by necessity is fairly well structured, and yet the student activities program in itself, by its very nature, is flexible. For instance, within a department, if a group of students are interested in pursuing, let's say, a foreign language or a particular subject in biology or botany, that they can do this on an extracurricular level. They can go beyond what is done in the classroom.
These tend to attract a minority of students. No, I don't think these extracurricular activities actually do siphon off any great amount of energy. They tend to give a forum to those students who have already marked out perhaps some professional objective which can be advanced by participation in student government, in the newspaper.
On the other hand, I think that if they did not have student government, and if they did not have the newspaper, they would be most unhappy, because it's sort of traditional to have these things, and they're convinced that they don't have them, they're missing something that's their proper right to have. But I don't think it does most of them an ounce of good.
Now, in the social field, I suspect that social relations with college students become most difficult when they have to live in group housing. Many of them have had to live with large numbers of students in dormitories or in college housing. And problems of study, and when you have large numbers of people, the temptation to socialize instead of study. If you're not inclined to want to be a learner anyhow, this is very attractive. You know, you can always go off someplace and talk to somebody and have a lot of fun.
I tend to deplore the system that presumes that each student must have a roommate or 2 or 3 roommates. I rather like the European system where each student has his own room and his own private place to study. I think we pursue group activity ad nauseum at times.
If a student feels that he does belong to an institution, he is going to do better in his academic life than if he feels he does not really fit in. A dormitory can go a long way toward building this self-feeling that you do belong to an institution.
I can remember my own dormitory life, and all the dormitory was, for me, was a place to get out of as quick as I could when I wanted to learn something. It interfered more than it ever contributed. Now, this might have been the fault of the dormitory I was in. It might have in part have been my fault, the fault of the students, might have been the fault of the college, I don't know. I don't think that dormitories, as I have seen them, are very conducive to the learning process. I think also coffee shops are much overrated in this regard. I don't think that they're very effective places in which to learn.
If they weren't here, I don't feel that they would be spending their time in the library, or they would be spending their time in their biology or a chemistry lab. They probably would be sitting in a dorm or in the lounge or on the stairways of a building, and I don't think that it is really detracting at all from their studies.
I think that the coffee shop should be a place where faculty as well as students commingle, and that the faculty member should see in himself the responsibility of using that coffee shop as some kind of classroom. I think it might even be wise occasionally for the faculty member to prepare for that classroom and to go to the coffee shop with a particular series of problems or questions in mind, or even occasionally to bring something with him about which he can develop some kinds of problems, and then lead this discussion. In that sense, I think that the coffee shop can become a learning situation. I don't think they normally are. I think they're a waste of time. I think the primary function of a college is intellectual awakening.
Oh, we've got to awaken curiosity about the whole great, big, wonderful world. Not just the present, but the past world, too. The human being is a strange sort of creature. At infancy, as it begins to walk, talk, become aware of the world around it, its curiosity knows no limits whatever. It will lead a child, an infant, into very dangerous positions, investigating things that catch the eye and make him wonder. Now, we lose this as we grow older. We accumulate a certain amount of information and assume that that's all there is that we need to have, that there are limits upon what we need to get along in this world. One of the exciting things about being a teacher is to point out that the world is so infinite in variety that we can make a student waken up to the idea that the whole wide world is there to be seen, to be investigated, as an infant would investigate it, and perhaps get himself out on a dangerous limb in the process, hoping, of course, he'll come back. But he must go out and look at these things.
How do we awaken curiosity in a student? Well, first place, I think the professor must surely be an example. He must demonstrate that he himself has curiosity. He must demonstrate that he has enthusiasm for his subject. And one of the ways of demonstrating that you have enthusiasm for your subject is to demonstrate curiosity. Now, these things are important that you demonstrate them as an instructor, because the student will assume very surely, if you don't demonstrate these things, that there isn't anything in the subject worth demonstrating them about.
For example, I could simply teach my subject as a fact by fact account of how something happened, but in reality I have done nothing but give the student a factual chronology, or a number of facts strung on a chronology like beads on a string.
The The notion that you can package as stuff as you would sardines, and knowledge is packaged as sardines, is pure nonsense.
But what you must do in the classroom is, having presented a certain number of facts, you lead the students to interpret what those facts mean. Indeed, it's, I think, perfectly delightful experience to lead a young person who has some factual information through a logical process, and suddenly so a kind of awakening, and he suddenly realizes, I thought of the idea that those facts sum up, you see.
Furthermore, directly I think you can initiate some of this kind of curiosity and asking questions, which I think is really synonymous, by demanding this kind of activity of your students. You can virtually order them to be curious, not saying be curious now, but rather you can set up situations where it is required that they come up with observations of their own, that they postulate, that they ask questions that are their own, that they seek answers in ways that are their own, that they postulate solutions to questions that are their own. You can expect this of a student. I have found that when I expect this, I tend to get it. And I know that further, when a student develops the habit of doing this through being expected to do it, it carries on. It's not a one-shot enterprise that he does it here and then stops it. You can't turn it off that way. Once you've gotten into the habit of being curious about things and asking why this particular worm is located at this particular spot now, pretty soon it becomes an entrenched attitude, and it will carry on.
But it takes more than just curiosity. You can be curious without having any tools to pursue the curiosity. You have to go beyond curiosity to the tools, to the media, to the independent study habits. And it's almost a habit of pursuing an idea till you're satisfied with the conclusion. And if you don't do this, you could be curious all your life about something and never get the answer to it.
I think it is impossible to teach a course in biology in which the qualities of curiosity are awakened without their learning at the same time the more mundane aspects of biology.
My goodness, any discipline today, and the way that the information in a discipline is building up, you can't tell them everything. But what you can do is teach them the method whereby they analyze the materials of the discipline and then turn them loose, and with any set of materials that come to hand, to use that process in interpretation. And it is actually awakening them to their own potential to analyze and to understand the information which comes to them from diverse sources, not just from libraries, but from the experience of life itself.
The notion that the job of the professor is to open up the student's head and dump in a lot of information is a misconstruction of the functions of teaching, in my notion. It would be bad teaching at any level, kindergarten through graduate school. The main function of the teacher, knowing the materials in his field, is to set some structures within which the student may work to find new areas of knowledge for himself.
I do not regard myself as primarily a teacher. A teacher, I take it, is charged with a much weightier responsibility than mine, and that is to, in some sense, induce, inveigle, force, or persuade children to learn. It is my task to take a given discipline, and in a series of lectures and or seminars, to present this discipline as interestingly as I may, and as authoritatively as I may, keeping up with current literature in the field. Let them learn who will, let those attend who will, let those fail to learn or not attend who will. I think this is an intrinsic difference between a professor and a teacher.
It is my conviction that if the professor has an enthusiasm for his subject, and not only an enthusiasm for the subject, but certain rather definite and positive convictions on issues raised by the subject, assuming, of course, that he does not try to ram those convictions down his students' throats, that he will have a greater impact upon the class, that they will learn more from him, they will be more likely to engage in a discussion with him than if he assumes a top, lofty bystander's point of view as though he were utterly aloof and indifferent.
It's a great intellectual battlefield. I like to approach my classes in biology with the idea that I want to win every student in that class into biological science. This is the way in which I gather the enthusiasm I need to properly present that course. I want every one of them into that class, not just the bright, but I want the miserable ones, the mediocre ones, and the very fine ones to enter biology as a field. I don't really want this, because you can imagine how unfortunate it would be if they all did this. I simply want to approach it with that attitude. Well, I think that if all college professors entered every class with this in mind, imagine it in history, in anthropology, and in every discipline that a student is exposed to, that when it came time that he had to select a profession, that he would be in a great dilemma. He would not be able to say, I want to enter this discipline because because Professor X was so very good. Instead, what he would have to say is, gee, I've had such fine instruction from so many people that I had better select a discipline that is more adaptable to my own interests and my own personality and my own abilities.
I believe that the personality of the instructor is important. There are brilliant scholars who can't teach worth a darn. On the other hand, there are some teachers who are not as brilliant scholars who can guide, inspire, and sort of catch the student on fire. And quite frankly, I think that the best teacher has an obligation to try to set the student on fire, to challenge his imagination, to excite him, to excite his curiosity, and to lead him to something that he knew not of before.
Professors in time come to believe that they are, if not demigods, at least the vice-regents of the Lord on this earth. And their classes come to be clothed with their own minds that make what go on there truth and much more important than what goes on the outside. I suspect that most professors, certainly I feel this way concerning myself, are at times subject to the imperial madness. You know, in our own classroom, we are virtually all powerful. And we therefore come to believe what we say from the lecture podium, rather than realizing that at best we approximate truth, that we frequently mutilate it, and that in any event we don't know enough to be effective in some of the areas that we purport to cover.
I believe that the teacher has an obligation to pursue truth and to tell the student or to show the student, put the student onto, if only through books, what is generally conceived to be truth, or to let him look at truth. On the other hand, the student can read much of the past in books, and I think the student wants to know what the professor thinks. The thing that worries me is that sometimes the professor may expound as truth what he only thinks and not let the student know that this is just his own opinion. I hate to see this kind of subtle indoctrination happening in the classroom.
Well, indeed, of course, the professor does have a great deal of influence. He can set patterns of thought, can even by his example set patterns of behavior in his students that will last perhaps a lifetime. And he's got to be very careful, I think, in his relationship with a student in order not to impress upon him certain patterns that might not really be desirable or might not be suitable to that young person. He can wield a kind of Machiavellian influence, too, if he wishes to, and it's done. It's done.
Yes, I think there is a danger of forming a student in your own image. If we can imagine a college campus where there are 300 miserably poor teachers, granted this is a theoretical situation, but 300 miserably poor teachers and one shining star, then I think the problem is real. That there will be a tendency for almost all the students to try and go into the profession of this shining star. I think that if you have a great many very fine professors, the odds of this kind of thing developing are poor.
But by the time the student comes to college, he is, and I think layman and professor alike, that we tend to forget this on occasion, a man or woman grown. He is not easily changed in terms of moral value judgments. A great deal of the ink that is spilt and anguish that is poured out over professors influencing the tender minds of the students ignore the fact that the Bubus Americanus Collegiensis is probably about as tough-minded an individual as ever come down the pike normally. That they're not readily influenced by their professors, that much more readily they question what professor says than accept it whole cloth. And certainly this is true when the professor begins making pronouncements ex cathedra concerning manners, morals, mores, politics, or religion.
And at the same time, I think we have a heavy obligation to let the student know how we feel about these things. If we don't, there certainly isn't anything that the student can't get over in the library.
Are you familiar with the study which the editors of Time did and published in the book called They Went to College?
No.
They addressed themselves to this problem in a chapter on the inculcation of religious, philosophical, and political attitudes and beliefs. Specifically, they asked the question, are college students changed in political belief by the effect of going to college? The editors of Time could find no conclusive evidence, indeed very little inconclusive evidence, that the political beliefs of the instructors influenced the child at all. In fact, I think it is notorious that at the Ivy League colleges, the overwhelming majority of PhDs instructing in the subjects are Democrats. The overwhelming number of the alumni, on the other hand, are Republican. And it's been this way for donkey's years.
What it seems to me a good teacher does is to teach a student to respect his own opinion, but to be certain of how he handles the facts as he reaches that opinion. Much of the teaching process, and I think this is true of any discipline, and it's a kind of truism that will apply to every subject, is to teach the student that the facts by themselves are not adequate, that the facts as interpreted by the professor are not the only adequate means of explaining any particular phenomenon, but that he must bring the totality of what he knows to a particular topic under consideration and reach mature, sound judgments of his own.
I think in discussions of this sort we frequently ignore the responsibility of the student in the business of academia. But obviously the primary responsibility for any kind of learning rests squarely upon the learner. And all that any instructor can do at any level is hope to lead them in a path by which they can most efficiently do this. But they cannot make them learn. They must do this themselves.
I think many students just take courses because they're there to take and they have to be taken, without reference to what am I doing now? Why am I doing it? And what is it going to lead to? And they live, in a sense, from day to day, from examination to examination, from textbook chapter to textbook chapter, without reference to overall learning goals.
They have a saying in the student argot that I've psyched the professor out. I know what he wants, and he'll give it back on an examination.
Sometimes college students begin to inquire of each other, who is the person who teaches this course from whom I'm likely to get the best grade? If they're swapping stories about professors, as they usually do, then many times they are less interested in digging in and working for themselves than they are, well, I won't say a social romp, I'll say that they're perhaps interested in taking an easier way out, particularly in some of the difficult courses.
I think I would have to add, in justice, that frequently classes get in the way of acquiring an education. A professor will require a student to do rote work in the classroom when the student would be better off reading books on his own hook. Sometimes, I think, therefore, a student should rebel, particularly the very bright student. Here I might point out the haunting fact that students who make the honor roll are rarely the brightest students in a college or university. The brightest student in a college or university, ever and anon, decides that he will not study for a given exam. He instead will read a book or write a poem, or go for a walk, with the result that he makes high B, and the grind student, superior but not very superior in intelligence, tends to make the A.
But primarily, I think, with regard to study, or the studies of college, his obligation is to bring into the learning situation as much effort as he can to learn to be self-directive in learning.
I think that any student coming to a college is undertaking a type of contract with the society that provides the college for him and with the academic community to which he comes. He's admitted because he's brighter than average and because he's done reasonably good work in high school. It is assumed that he is here to learn. I don't think we have the time, nor do we possess the police powers to force him to learn. Now here we get into an interaction between professorial responsibility and student responsibility. In many cases, we simply do not interest the bright student enough to cause him to put out maximal effort. In many cases, on the other hand, demands of urgent biology, the social life, desire to be a big man on campus, or what have you, get in the way of acquiring an education.
As I look at the developments in the areas of knowledge, I don't think we're going to be able in 4 years of college to say that a person at any point in his life is now an educated person. You can say about him only, he has the characteristics of an educated person. But to say that he is now educated, no. He doesn't bear the stamp of educated. He bears the stamp of he is now educating himself. He has the tools for educating himself. Because as knowledge expands in all areas, as more is to be known, as fields are changing rapidly, and as people have to be retreaded, if you will, for new jobs, this becomes an ever-increasing problem with our society. We have to acquire facility in acquiring new knowledge. And if we are not self-starters, if we are not independent learners, when we get out of the public schools or when we get out of college, there's no hope for many of us. We'll be obsolete in 10 years or 8 years or 5 years in some fields. We have to keep learning. The doctor has to keep learning. The teacher has to keep learning. The engineer has to keep learning. The citizen has to keep learning. There's no end to learning. So we can say now about the educated man, he is a man who learns, not he is a man who knows.
I think it was Eliot of Harvard who in an earlier day once defined the proper process of higher education. And that was to lead the students through the charted fields to the edge of the unknown woods, and to say, this far and no further came your fathers. Now press you on.
The Professor Looks at His College was edited from over 4 hours of recorded interviews with 8 professors of Western Washington State College. This program was produced by Al Swift and John Spaulding and presented by the KVOS Television Department of Public Affairs in cooperation with the college.